Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Cowboy Seal's Secret Baby by Janalyn Knight, narrated by Hugo, Locke, and Elizabeth Russell. Chapter 1. Flint Carswell pulled up in front of the Black Brush, Texas post office, the roar of the Ford F-350's powerful engine rumbling in his ears. As he killed the engine, the silence of an early spring morning surrounded him. He picked up a stack of envelopes from the pristine leather passenger seat, noting the clipboard with his half-finished business plan lying there. It was something he needed to finish, so he could make an appointment at the bank. He glanced up just as a beautiful woman stepped out of the post office's glass door. Morgan Flemming? They'd had a week-long fling on his leave last year, when he was still a Navy SEAL. Damn, he'd forgotten how sexy she was. In fact, he'd forgotten all about her. He always forgot the women he caroused with during the few times a year that he escaped Afghanistan or whatever war-torn ass end of the world the U.S. Navy sent him to. The last thing he'd been interested in during that booze-hazed week was making any kind of connection with Morgan, past drinking, screwing, and sleeping. The act of killing, so alien to the nature he was born with, took everything from him, leaving a man cold and hard, a man who kept emotions that might cause weakness buried so deep that they might never exist at all. But exist they did, and his nightmares were proof of them. Easy sleep was something he'd given up on long ago. Now that he didn't have combat to fill his days, throwing himself into ranch work kept flashbacks of battle at bay. But come evening time, he was prey to the memories of war, death, and losses too terrible to remember. He clenched the steering wheel and focused on Morgan. She turned and headed in the opposite direction, and he sighed, enjoying the view of her extremely fine ass, one he remembered grasping in his palms on more than one occasion. He stomped the parking brake and opened the door, angry with the turn of his thoughts. He couldn't have a woman in his life. Not now. Not ever. He'd proven he wasn't up to the task of taking responsibility for others. Hell, he'd proved it in spades. After his final mission as platoon chief in Afghanistan, he'd cashed it all in. Having spent 12 years in the service, most of them as a Navy SEAL, he hadn't re-enlisted. He glanced down the sidewalk once more, but Morgan had disappeared. Just as well. She wasn't for him. Yanking the post office door wide, he strode inside. Before he faced the clerk, he pushed war far from his thoughts, his way of coping with the pain that had been with him since that terrible day in a brutal country that he wished he'd never seen, that he wished didn't exist, that he prayed to God every night to drive from his mind forever. A few moments later, with his stamp purchase made and the envelopes mailed, he returned to the truck. His glance landed on the clipboard. After starting the engine, and as cool air flooded the cab, he began to read the notes he'd made over the last few days, outlining what needed to be done to implement his plan to modernize the Carswell ranch. Modernization was critical if the ranch was to remain viable. The ranch's profit margin had been going down for years until it was nearly at the break-even point. It couldn't go on doing business the old-fashioned way anymore. His father, Griff Carswell, had begun the first step in the new modernization program before Flint had ever left Afghanistan by pulling the bulls from several of their herds. Flint intended to turn the ranch's traditional cow-calf operation to one where cows were artificially inseminated, making the pregnancy rate close to 100% and driving up profits. This was an expensive process, and a keystone to this plan would be applying for a small business loan at their bank. To do this, preparing a detailed business plan was critical. As he shifted the truck into reverse, His thoughts bounced back to Morgan. They'd done very little talking in their time together last year. About the only thing he remembered about her was that she was an ER nurse at the hospital. He'd gotten the impression that she was desperately trying to forget something, though. That had been fine with him, because it was what he did on his leave time, too. He'd spent every hour away from his service and country forgetting death and destruction. Morgan had been fantastic at helping him do that. He thrust her from his mind again. He couldn't have a woman in his life. Not permanently. He would not bear the responsibility of another person again, and he had to figure out a way to avoid Morgan at all costs. Crushing the accelerator, he gunned the truck out of the parking spot and headed back to the ranch.
Morgan yanked her car door open and slunk down in the seat, breathing fast and wishing she'd never had the brilliant idea to pick up her Amazon package this morning instead of waiting until after work. Every stride she'd taken since leaving the post office had been an agony of embarrassment after she'd recognized Flint Carswell pulling up in his huge black truck. She knew what he must think of her after last year's week of debauchery with him. That was the most accurate word she knew to describe the drinking and partying and mindless screwing they'd done for 6 long days and nights during one of the worst periods she'd ever gone through in her life. How many times had she regretted meeting Flint at the barbed wire bar the week she'd taken her annual leave? The place had been where she'd spent most of her free time anyway in those terrible weeks following her mother's unexpected death. She never told him why she was there drinking the night they met. Talking about her loss would have been unbearable. She was there to forget, to blast her loss from her mind and her heart with every ounce of the energy she possessed. She'd realized after one look at the desperation in his beautiful brown eyes that she'd met a kindred soul. Floundering after losing the one person who had always shielded her from her father's brutal attacks, she hadn't cared to get to know the taciturn, overbearing, and devastatingly handsome Navy SEAL. He'd given her everything she'd needed: alcohol to dull her mind, great sex to make her forget her pain, and the occasional meal to fuel her body. Her memory of the time was pretty hazy, yet some things stood out. How outstandingly sexy he looked naked. How gentle he could be when he seduced her. And his deep, irresistible laugh. But mostly she remembered him taking charge, moving her through those days as she operated in a daze. They'd both drunk far too much, lived in the hotel where driving was non-essential, and had stayed in bed until hunger drove them out. When Flint's leave was up, she dimly recalled his laissez-faire goodbye. With a quick kiss as he squeezed her ass, he'd held the hotel room door open for her. She'd had the distinct impression that he couldn't get rid of her fast enough. Somehow, that experience had put a period to the worst of her depression. She'd visited her doctor, and he'd put her on an antidepressant. He'd also recommended the women's clinic in town where she'd qualified for free counseling, which she'd started right away. In the months that followed, she'd begun to deal with the death of her mother from stomach cancer a mere 3 weeks after her diagnosis. But even more important, she'd also begun healing from a childhood filled with a deep-seated fear of her abusive father, as well as from the rage that had crippled her heart. She'd told no one, not even her best friend Bailey, of her terrible lapse in judgment. She raised her head above the window ledge and peered down the line of cars. Flint's truck was long gone. Heaving a sigh of relief, she sat up and started her old Ford Escort, thankful when it turned over after only 10 or 12 whirs of the starter. It had been a nice sedan when it had rolled off the assembly line in 1990, but now it was an old beater, The only type of car she could afford. She'd acquired it when she'd fled home after graduating high school. She'd made payments while she went to nursing school to the woman who'd been only too glad to get rid of it. Flint's face flashed before her again. Hell. She'd hoped to avoid him when her best friend Bailey, who just happened to be Flint's little sister, had told her that he was back in town for good. It appeared that Flint hadn't told his family who he'd been seeing last year when he'd come home on leave. From now on, Morgan would be on the lookout for him. The last thing she wanted was to come face to face with the seal-turned-cowboy.
Saturday morning, Flint's truck rounded the corner in the bank's parking lot to find the drive-up lanes full with several cars each. All except one, that is. Too late, he recognized the lone car in it as Morgan's. Groaning as he coasted up behind her, he rolled down his window like he always did in the drive-up queue. The grinding whir of a car's starter came from Morgan's car. He waited a moment, but the engine didn't turn over. Damn it. After a short silence, the sound ground on. Hell, he couldn't leave her sitting there. Despite how uncomfortable it would be, he had to do something. As he stepped out of his truck, her head turned, and frantic hazel eyes met his in the rearview mirror. His heart thumped, and his protective instincts went into overdrive. He squeezed between the concrete curb and the old sedan as he approached her open window, and then leaned down to peer inside. Her face was the deep red of intense embarrassment, and she dropped her gaze. Though he had a sudden urge to cup her cheek in his hand and tell her that everything would be fine, instead, he said gruffly, "I'll push you out of the way and take a look." She nodded, silently. He glanced at the gear shift, put it in neutral. Without a word, she complied. "And turn hard." She nodded again, her lips in a grim line. "I will." He pointed to the side of the bank's parking lot. "Park over there." Her gaze followed his finger to a row of empty parking spaces, and she swallowed, then said, "Sure." As he climbed back into his truck, he wondered if his bumper was too tall to meet hers. People in the other lines were watching his every move. He inched towards Morgan's car, letting his big steel bumper kiss hers. It was close, but okay. She clutched the steering wheel as he nudged her car into motion. They left the covered area, and when it came to turn, she struggled mightily, but didn't give up. He kept the car moving, and she hung on, tugging hard until it pointed into a parking spot. He hit the brakes, and she cruised to a stop. Morgan squared her shoulders as she ran her fingers through her long blonde hair. He sighed. She had some grit, all right. Well, time to find out what side the battery was on. As he walked up, the sound of the hood popping came to him. Good for her. She'd even given him room to work in front of the car. After looking inside, he parked on the left of her car and grabbed his heavy-duty jumper cables from the toolbox in the back of his truck. He stopped at her window and held them up. "Have some of these?" She looked them over. No." "Buy 'em." No one should be without a pair of jumper cables. He hooked up the positive and negative cables to his truck battery, then did the same to her car. After glancing her way, he said, "Don't start it till I tell you." His more powerful engine should start the old car in a jiffy. She nodded crisply, but didn't meet his gaze. "Okay." He'd left his truck running and went over to stand at his door for a minute, letting her car battery charge up a bit. It would probably start now, but he needed a second or two to get his shit together. He wasn't prepared for how the woman was affecting him. She looked overwhelmed, yet she was still trying to be brave. God, he wanted to pull her out of the car and wrap his arms around her, to whisper in her ear that he'd make everything okay, that she didn't need to worry. Because he could tell that she was worried sick. Hell, he was going to do something about that, and right now. Walking back around to her window, he said, "Start it." She turned the key, but instead of the sound of a motor catching, he heard the same old grinding whir. He throttled a growl. Stop. If it wasn't starting right off, the battery just needed to be cleaned up a bit. After getting some tools from his truck, he scraped the posts and the cables. Then he walked around and got inside his truck. Revving the engine, he let it run full out for 5 minutes. Exhaust fumes filled the air as the powerful engine shook the chassis. When he came back this time, he was confident the car would start. Crossing his arms, he barked, "Again?" "Right." She turned the key. He nearly groaned aloud when the same whir reached his ear. With a disgusted sigh, he pulled out his phone. "I'll have it towed to the shop I use." "Wait, He hadn't thought it possible, but she was an even deeper shade of red. "I mean, I don't think I can—" Oh, he understood. "Don't worry." After punching a number, the phone began to ring. "The owner and I have an arrangement." She nodded, slowly, her eyes filling up. Damn it to hell. The woman was breaking his heart. As he spoke to the garage, arranging for a tow, she got on her phone, but he couldn't hear what she said. Was she calling a boyfriend? His pulse sped up. Somehow, he didn't like that idea. He hung up and asked, "Someone coming for you?" She raised her hand to her throat. "No, Going somewhere?" Her face went blank. Then she said, "Home, I guess." As he walked toward the hood, he said over his shoulder, "I'll drop you." After returning the cables to the toolbox, he strode to her door and opened it. "Leave the keys in it." Grabbing her purse and looking like a lost little girl, she stepped out. He helped her up into the tall truck, then handed her the seatbelt. He didn't remember her being so slender. Had she been ill? That thought bothered him. A lot. A moment later, as he pulled out of the bank driveway, he realized he didn't know where she lived. When he glanced over, she took a deep breath and threw her shoulders back. That was better. "Directions?" She nodded. "Turn left on Main Street, go to Cedar and turn right. I'll guide you from there." Now that they were alone, he had no idea what to say to her. He couldn't exactly say, "Remember when we got drunk and screwed?" Adjusting his Stetson lower on his brow, he cleared his throat, noticing that she'd slid all the way against the passenger door. What? Was she afraid of him or something? "How you been?" God, that sounded awkward. She clutched her hands in her lap. "I'm still working in the ER. You might not know this, but Bailey's my best friend." What the hell? Really? She glanced quickly at him, then held his gaze valiantly. "Yeah, we both work at the hospital, but, of course, she's not in the ER. God, she sounded as uncomfortable as he felt. "That's great." Nodding, she stared out her window. A moment later, she said, "Turn left here on Prickly Pear Drive. My house is the 5th house on the right." He pulled up on the curb outside her house and noticed a car in the driveway. Company? Did someone live here with her? Like a guy? Why hadn't he thought of that? She followed his gaze. "Oh, yeah." So it was company. He hated that he was relieved. Letting the engine idle, he unlocked the doors. She fumbled with the door handle. Flint? I don't know how to thank you." He shook his head, meeting her gaze before she bit her lip and lowered it. "Not necessary." Damn it, she looked like a caged animal. "You work the next couple of days?" She nodded. 7 to 3, daytime. "I'll check with the garage Monday morning. Stop by with an update." Mumbling a choked-up thanks, she opened her door and slid down to the ground. His heart thudded as he watched her walk to her door. One thing was certain. He'd make sure that her car problems were a thing of the past. Whatever her worries were, that damned car wouldn't be one of them.
Morgan slipped into the house and closed the door, then leaned her back against it, her knees shaking. God, the humiliation. Flint Carswell. Of all the men in the entire town, it had to be him who pulled up behind her. He was as she remembered him. Just as terse, just as closed-mouthed, and God help her, more than anything, just as kind. Yes, she'd finally recalled those things as she'd sat in the car while he'd worked to start it. During that time together, when they'd danced, his clasp had been easy. When he'd touched her, his hands had been gentle. And when he'd had her in his bed, he'd treated her with an unexpected tenderness. She'd done everything she could to wipe that awful week from her mind. Now, though, she realized that maybe she had parts of it wrong. Maybe it wasn't quite as horrific as she remembered. Yet the humiliation of being his week-long drunken plaything couldn't be ignored. God, how could he stand to look at her? What kind of a person must he think she was? She squared her shoulders and walked into the living room. Madison looked up from her homework.
"Hi, Morgan. She was wonderful."
Violet lay cuddled in the crook of her elbow. Morgan couldn't help but smile like she always did when she first laid eyes on her 3-month-old daughter after being away. "Good. I know you didn't expect me home this early, but I had to cancel my hair appointment when my car broke down." It was a testament to the sad state of Morgan's financial affairs that her babysitter drove a better car than she did. Digging money from her wallet, she paid the girl, took Violet in her arms, and walked Madison to the front door. "Thanks again, honey. I really appreciate how good you are with her." Madison grinned over her shoulder.
"Shoot, she's easy. She hardly ever cries, and then it's 'cause she's wet or wants her bottle. I love taking care of her."
Morgan returned to the living room and sat in the rocker. What Madison had said was true. Violet was an exceptionally good baby. And thank God. The pressure of being a single mom was overwhelming. With a rotating schedule at the hospital, she needed daytime and evening care, weekday and weekend care, and no one person was willing to provide everything. Then there was the price of infant care. God, it cost a lot. She'd never realized that until she had one of her own. Add in diapers and wipes and formula and clothes and doctors and medicine, and it was unbelievably expensive. That didn't even take into consideration actually having the baby. The co-pays on her prenatal care had wiped out her meager savings, and the hospital delivery would take years to pay off. Factor in student loans, and there was never a penny to spare. She leaned her head back and closed her eyes. Her burden seemed overwhelming sometimes. Violet cooed and kicked her feet. Morgan looked at her and smiled. "You're worth every cent, aren't you beautiful?" Violet's dark blue gaze held Morgan's, and it warmed her down to her toes. Yes, it was worth it. Being Violet's mom was the most precious gift in all the world, and she would love her and protect her with her body's last breath. That brought Flint to mind again, along with the alcohol haze-filled time she'd spent with him. When she'd met the gorgeous Navy SEAL, she'd expected the guy to be able to help drive the pain of her mother's loss far from her tortured mind. What she hadn't been prepared for, what she had been devastated by, was the fallout from that week of unrestrained abandon with a man whom she'd never expected to see again. Later, as she'd endured the terrible distress from delving deep into her emotional chaos, it had taken her weeks to realize that something else was wrong. Still, She'd nurtured the hope that she was mistaken until the morning that the 2 bars had appeared on her over-the-counter pregnancy test. What had been worse was that she'd known it was her fault. She'd missed the occasional birth control pill in the frantic, desperate weeks following her mother's death. And, though she'd thought they'd used condoms during that delirious week, who knew if they'd forgotten a time or two in their drunken sexual abandon? She surely couldn't say she remembered every detail of their liaisons. He probably couldn't either. As a nurse, she knew better than to indulge in the wanton behavior she'd exhibited. What's worse, her daughter had been conceived while Morgan had been drinking heavily. No, she'd been incredibly irresponsible. Despite her new memories of Flint's past gentleness, she hadn't changed her mind about anything. After all, her mother must have seen something in her father when she'd married him. He could have been gentle and kind at first. He could have fooled her mother completely. Morgan sighed. If only her mother were still alive, she could ask her about it. Could ask her why she'd married such a cruel, brutal husband. She scrubbed her brow with her fingers, hoping to ease the tension there. Flint. No, he wasn't the man for her. After being raised by an authoritarian, abusive father, the last thing she wanted was to be with an uptight military type who thought he could tell her what to do. Not only would it get on her last nerve, when she wasn't drunk out of her gourd, that is, but she knew only too well how that personality could turn dangerous. Flint was just plain bossy. A person like that could go wrong fast. She wasn't about to chance having someone like him near her daughter. No siree, she didn't need Flint in her life, and Violet certainly didn't need that kind of a father. Now she just had to figure out how she was going to hide Violet from him. She blew out a breath, feeling some of the tension leave with it. Time to face the big problem of the day. How would she take Violet to her sitters and get to work for the next couple of days? God, she needed coffee. She headed into the kitchen to fix herself a cup. Her options were slim. It would be the pits to wake Tina up early on a Sunday morning. Tina always woke at the crack of dawn and made it to her first-grade class an hour before the first bell to set up for her students. Morgan understood how she treasured her sleep on the weekends. There was always Bailey, but she had the day off tomorrow, too. Morgan disliked the idea of asking her to wake up early on her day off. As she walked back into the living room, her cell phone rang, and she hurried to dig it out of her purse. It was Bailey. Morgan groaned. Oh, man, have I had a morning. Bailey chuckled. I heard. That's why I'm calling. Would you like a ride to work in the morning? Girl, I couldn't do that to you. Morgan shifted Violet to her shoulder. Nonsense. I'm happy to. You'd do it for me. The phone clattered. Sorry, I'm trying to put on my makeup while I talk. Brian and I headed into Alice in a little while. Thanks. I guess I'll take you up on your offer then. Now you go on. And you're right. I sure would give you a ride. I love you bunches. As Morgan hung up, a little tingle raced up her abdomen. So Flint had asked Bailey to help her? That was kind of sweet. And so unexpected from the gruff cowboy. Her mouth tilted in a smile. What a tough guy. Not.
Chapter 2. Monday morning, Flint entered the ER and nodded to the security guard. Need to speak to Morgan? The guard looked him up and down. Your reason? Flint brandished the car keys. These? The guard punched a button. Go on back. As Flint strode through the door to the back, he searched down the hallway and around the main area, which was filled with desks and monitors. Morgan exited a curtained patient room, her gaze locked with his, her eyes widening as she stopped in her tracks. He held up her keys as he continued. She nodded.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?